picture this. So say this is all happening in a castle. Okay, that should be easy, right? It's happening in a castle, right? And picture a summer evening, warm summer evening. That's easy too. It's a summer evening. Right? Now go back in time and say this was one of these crazy Baroque parties. Okay, that might be a bit harder. Okay, but try. Okay, and then within these Baroque parties, they would have had plays, right, with actors. So say this is a play. Okay, of course it would be structured according to the standard, the classic dramatic structure, right? 5 acts, pyramid shape. That's exactly what I'm going to do, right? The talk will be structured in 5 acts. And there will be a proper hero, and there will be a setting for that hero. And the hero will be, of course, logic, right? And the setting will be the neurosciences. Okay. Now, it will be slightly more boring than one of these cool Baroque plays, right? So there will be no murders, I'm afraid, right? No love stories. There will be some wars in between, which will be fought. So that's something. And I won't tell you whether this is all a comedy or a tragedy. So you'll find out about that. But first, let me introduce to you our protagonist, our hero. That's logic, right? That's the first act in a classic drama. And that's what we're going to do. So what's logic, right? So that's my daily business, as it were. Because, as you've heard, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a logician and a philosopher. So this won't be a typical neuroscience talk, right? It will more be a logical talk. But if you come from the neurosciences, I hope it will be interesting in a different way to you, too. Logic. Traditionally, logic would be conceived of as the study of correct or valid reasoning. That's the pretty much classical definition of what logic is, the study of correct reasoning. These days, we would qualify a statement like that, but for most of our purposes in this talk, this will be just fine. So here's a typical example, right? That's a bit of logic. Say you're given 3 informations from whatever sources, doesn't really matter. That's not what the logician is interested in. But just take these informations at face value. That's the first premise, right? Hannes Leitgeb's lecture takes place in the Schlossrondell, right, here, or at the university. Now actually, of course, you know, right, this is true, it actually takes place in the Schlossrondell, right? But forget about that, okay? Just take it as a given. You don't know anything except for these 3 premises. So the lecture takes place in the Schlossrondell, case 1, or it takes place at the university, right? My university, the Ludwig Maximilian's university, say. That's the second case. In principle, both of them could be true, right? Doesn't really matter. Although, right, tacitly you might think it will be either of them. But we will rule out one case very soon anyway. Okay, so that's the first information. Second information, if the lecture does take place at the university, so that's in the second case, right? Then there is presently nothing going on in the Schlossrondell, okay? Because, you know, this evening, nothing else was planned here, okay? So that gives you an if-then statement, right? Which tells you more about the second case, right? If it's in the university, then nothing's going on in the Schlossrondell. And then actually, someone whispers in your ear, by the way, I've seen something, right? It's not the case that there is presently no lecture in the Schlossrondell, okay? Right, they heard some buzzing activity from the Schlossrondell. Okay, so actually in this second case, right, this would have to hold. Nothing going on in the Schlossrondell, but there is presently a lecture there, right? It's not the case that there is presently no lecture. So you can rule out the second case, so only the first case is going to remain, and you're going to conclude, oh, actually, Hannes Leitgeb's lecture is going to take place in the Schlossrondell, and that's really happening, okay? So this is a typical bit of correct reasoning. And what logicians would do is they would study inferences, right, from the premises to that conclusion systematically. That's what logic is all about. Okay. Now, what I will be interested in is, of course, there's something rational about this inference, right? What does this rationality consist in? And even more so, actually, you were able to draw this inference, right? I'm sure you did, because you're Humboldtians. Right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have got support from the Humboldt Foundation. So what exactly is it about you that put you in a position so that you were able to draw this inference? Okay? What does this capacity of being able to draw rational inferences consist in? And put like this, well, actually, this sounds like a pretty empirical question. And the scientists amongst you will just say, well, there's an obvious answer. It must have to do with my brain, right? There's something in my brain that made this inference happen, right? And being good scientists, you think of the brain as some sort of dynamical system, okay? So it's something like the solar system, if you like. It's just more complex. That's it, okay? So there are little bits and parts of your brain, like neurons and connections between neurons, and they can have little states, right? Put all of these little states together, and you get a big state for the whole system, right? And when then the system is undergoing some change, then there are state trajectories that start from one state of your brain to another, right? And along this trajectory somewhere, an inference will be drawn. That's the step where you have moved from the premises to the conclusions before, right? And there must be something about this trajectory that makes this trajectory rational and others not, okay? That would be a typical way in which the scientists would address my question, right? So you don't see that very well, but you see that shape here, and that's just, it's easy to recognize, right? So that's a Lorentz attractor, right? Typical case of a chaotic dynamical system, right? And it could describe the weather, the dynamics of the weather, right? Or liquids or whatever. Or it could describe what's going on in a neural network, all right? So that's again this same shape, the Lorentz attractor. But that's now the state space of a neural network. It's actually a very simple neural network with 3 nodes, that's all. Recurrent connections, that is, there is feedback, okay? And the network is set up in the way that the output looks like this, it becomes a chaotic system, okay? That's a typical way in which the dynamics of a neural network would be described, like the physicist describes the solar system, okay? So that's one way to address my question, right? And then we would go on and study this dynamics. When I say neural network, what I mean is artificial neural networks, right? So these are little abstract imitations of fragments of a biological brain, right? And you abstract away a lot of information in order to end up with a network like that, right? But once you've done this abstraction step, right, you can study the neural network and its dynamics in purely mathematical terms. Okay? You can apply standard mathematical theories to it. Now here is how the philosopher and the classical logician would address my question, right? What is it about this inference that turned it into something rational, right? What did happen in my mind when I drew the inference, okay? And the classical philosopher would say, well, actually, that's not a brain process, or at least I do not commit myself to that statement. It's a mental process, okay? It's a process that's going on in my mind, okay? I don't have a good picture of the mind, okay? But you know, mind in German is Geist. So, okay, that's the best I, was able to come up with, okay? That's the mind. And then you can see something in the mind is moving from the premises to the conclusion. That's sort of the premises and the conclusion in an abbreviated form, right? Remember the first premise said, right, it's either going on there or there. So this is this or here, P or Q, right? And then we had a statement, if you think about it, of the form, well, if it's the second case, then something else is the case. That's the R here. But R is not the case, so that's a negation sign. R is not the case. Right? So this second case would imply R is excluded. Since this is not the case, therefore the first must hold true. That was the inference that we were drawing. Okay? And there's something in my mind, and there's something about your minds, that made it, reach sort of these contents that can then be expressed in terms of sentences. Okay? And this relationship between the mind and its contents, that's what is called, in the philosophy of mind, intentionality. That's the intentionality relationship. So this is what Franz Brentano would say about that, philosopher who dealt a lot in his life with this relationship of intentionality. He would say, every mental phenomenon is characterized by what we might call reference to a content, right? These guys. Direction toward an object. every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself, although they do not all do so in the same way. Okay? So for example, you might imagine that something is the case, right? That's the content, this thing, that something is the case, that's a content like this. And what you do with this content is you imagine it, right? When you drew the inference, right, you were directed towards objects, okay, but not to imagine them, but to draw inferences from them to something like them again, right? If you judge something, then there is an object, and then you affirm it or deny it, right? You might love that something is the case. You might hate that something is the case. You might desire that something is the case, and so on. So these are all mental states, and all of them are directed towards an object, right? Like these here. So that's what a classical philosopher of mind would say about that, and that's how the logician would express the contents. Okay? That's a very different way, it seems at first sight, of addressing the whole question. Okay? Now, my talk will be about how to relate these two perspectives, which I claim to be perspectives on the same thing, right? In both cases, ultimately want to talk about the same phenomenon, but in very different terms. And if that is true, then these two sides must be related in some way. And my personal interest is in that sort of relationship. Okay? Now, Brentano would also add, no physical phenomenon exhibits anything like it, anything like this intentionality, this directedness towards an object like that. Right? And that's, of course, the point where, you know, the modern scientist would say, so hang on a sec, right? That's maybe a bit too quick, right? Because there's still the brain, which is in some way related to this thing, the mind, and so on. Okay? And of course, right? I agree with that completely. Now, the typical philosopher of mind would then start telling you something about these relationships here between the mind and the brain. Okay? And that's where, you know, the typical philosopher would then maybe with an audience like this, you know, on a summer evening like that, say something about the free will debate, right? How can we have free will on this level if everything seems to be pretty much deterministic on that level and so on. But that's not my topic today, okay? That's not what I'm interested in this talk, okay? But rather, sort of, I want to use these arrows to really relate this side, the brain, with that side, logic, right? There should be some sort of relationship, right? How this relationship is generated from these two arrows, right? I won't be interested so much, okay? But rather, I want to relate the logical side and the brain sort of directly. And actually, it won't be the real brain, but rather little artificial neural networks, these abstract imitations of the brain. That will be my focus. Okay. Let me tell you a little more about the philosophers or the logician's picture here, right? So Brentano would say, well, we are intentionally related to these contents. But what are these contents? Okay. Well, there is more that can be said about that. So I'll give you now the sort of the standard theory, right? That's what we teach our students. Okay. Sorry. So the founder of modern logic in the 19th century was Gottlob Frege, and he called these contents thoughts, right? So you might think, well, there's the mind, it's like a container, and what you find in a container, that's a thought. But that's not quite the picture that Frege had in mind, okay? For Frege, these thoughts are abstract objects, like numbers. And when the mathematician proves theorems about numbers, he or she is able to relate to these abstract objects in some way, right? And if we think or believe or hope or desire, then also we relate to abstract objects in some way, but not to numbers, but to thoughts, Gedanken. Okay? So these are abstract objects which live in the same realm as numbers. Okay? So they are not like mental events, but there's something in our mind, and let's say at the end in our brain, that puts us into a position to relate to these things. And these thoughts, these abstract objects, have different roles to play. One is the one that we had on the last slide, right? So they are the contents of our attitudes, right? Of the attitude of belief. I believe that there is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell. I infer that there is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell. I fear that this is so. I hope that this is so, and so on and so forth, right? You might not be in all of these states simultaneously, right? Okay. You shouldn't fear and at the same time hope, and so on, maybe. who knows, right? But sometimes you are in states like that. For example, I honestly believe that there is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell, okay? And Frege would say there is this abstract object that there is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell, and I relate to that mentally in some way, okay? And you do so too. And you can relate to the same thing in different ways, and that's what Brentano meant when he said, although they do not all do so in the same way, they have the same object, but not in the same way, right? They relate to the same thing, but in different ways. But there are further roles to play for these thoughts. Another is that they should be the meanings of descriptive or declarative sentences. So for example, take this sentence. There is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell. And Frege would say, it expresses the same thought as, es findet gerade eine Vorlesung im Schlossrondell statt. Right? Right? They have the same meaning. And that shows up in the way that they express the very same content in a different way, right? Fair enough. And for the same reason, right, you might say this sentence is true, but if it's true, this is just derivatively so, right? It's true because it expresses a true content. It expresses a true thought. The thought that there is presently a lecture in the Schlossrondell, that's true, right? And then, derivatively, every sentence that expresses that thought must be true too. Right? That's the reason why both of these sentences, the English one and the German one, are true. Because the thought that they express, that is true. Right? And the thought that there is presently no lecture in the Schlossrondell is false, and so on. Right? And these are the truth values. So these thoughts, amongst others, have the role of being the primary bearers of truth values. Right? They are the things that ultimately are true or false. And once you've realized that, you can see that there must be some sort of combinatorics of how to associate truth values, right, true or false, with these thoughts, these abstract objects that can be expressed by sentences. Right? And once logicians and philosophers had realized that, the next step was logic in the modern sense of the word. Right? So this is Wittgenstein in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, right? Right? So you see, it's all early 20th century now. An Austrian, by the way. I'm from Austria. Okay, I like to mention that. Okay. And here you can see this combinatoric. So take two, of these thoughts, as it were, right? Then both of them can be true. Both of them wahr, right? Or the one false, the other one true, or the other way around. F is falsch, false, right? Or both of them are false. That's all of the possibilities, right? 4 possible combinations, right? If you add a third statement like we did in our original argument, right? There was an R there, right? Then you get more combinations, right? So it's 2 times 2 times 2, right? 2 to the 3. That's 8 possible combinations, right? Now, once you have that, you might think, okay, I might be interested in P and Q, but also in P or Q, or in P and not Q, or something like that. And then the idea would be, right, again, combinatorics if you like, mathematics. There must be a systematic way of moving from the truth value of the more elementary things, P and Q, to the more complex thing, P and Q, right? The complex thought, its truth value, you should be able to determine from the truth values of the elementary thoughts, right? And that you can do. Now, you have to say whether the outcome should be true or false here, true or false here, true or false here, true or false here, right? So this gives you 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 combinations. So that's 16. There should be 16 truth functions, right? And that's exactly what you get if you go on, reading Wittgenstein's Tractatus, right? So these are the 16 truth functions in 2 arguments, right? Amongst which you, for example, find this one again, P or Q, right? And it would be true in these 3 cases. It's true when both P and Q are true. It's true when either of them is true and the other one false. And it's only false, this P or Q thing, when both are false, right? That's what P or Q says, right? At least one of them is true, right? Just when both are false, P or Q will be false. Okay. So this is not an exclusive or, right? It does not mean either P or Q is the case, but not both of them, right? If you were looking for that truth function, you would also find it here. But, let's just say or is the inclusive or, and that's what you have here, right? And so on and so forth. And once you have that thought, right, you're in the game of reconstructing why this inference is rational in the first place. And the idea is now, if it's possible at all to logically infer from these thoughts this other thought, right, then the reason must be that the truth, right, the W value, wahr, yeah, the truth value of these premises, right, sort of makes the conclusion true, necessitates the truth of the conclusion, right? In other words, whenever the premises are all true, the conclusion is true, and necessarily so. There is no other way, okay? And that's what logicians would then study, right? So let me give you a picture of why this inference is valid, okay? Why it's correct. A good way of picturing these thoughts is by the so-called Euler-Venn diagrams, right? Euler being Leonhard Euler, famous mathematician, Venn being John Venn, famous British logician from the 19th century. And they would picture what Frege called thoughts in terms of geometrical diagrams, right? You could also use them to picture sets, okay, classes of objects. But here they are used to picture thoughts, complex thoughts and elementary thoughts. So for example, say you're here, then this means you are P, Q, and R at the same time, right? Whereas if you're here, you're in the P area, but you're not in the Q area, right? You're here, that's outside of Q. And you're not in the R area. So this is P and not Q and not R, right? And you can see there are really 8 areas. Don't forget the outside one here, right? 8 areas, right? And that would be different combinations of truth values that you have here. So that's why we had 8 rows here in the truth table, right? Different ways of assigning truth or falsity to P, Q, and R. And they correspond here to these geometrical areas, okay? Now, why do the premises lead to the truth of the conclusion? Well, the idea is, let's assume they're all true, right? Let's assume you've been given true information, right? So then P or Q means, well, you know, the actual world, right, is somewhere here, right? It's P or Q. You could be here, 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 somewhere in this dotted area you must be. That's what P or Q means, right? Right? So assuming that P or Q is true, which you do when you draw the inference, right, you are here. But then if Q then R really means Q and not R cannot be the case, right? If Q then R means Q and not R cannot be the case, okay? So Q and not R would be these 2 areas here, right? That's Q, but outside of R. So Q and not R. And then if you're not here, you're somewhere in the rest, right? So not Q and not R gives you if Q then R. So that's again this dotted area, okay? So you must be here, but also here, according to the second information. And the third information then tells you, by the way, you're not in R, right? You're not in the R circle. So you're somewhere outside here. Now take these 3 informations together, right? Then really, where you must be is in that area here, right? Because that's the only one that's included in all of the dotted areas, right? It's the only possibility. Everything else you can rule out, right? So you're really here. And that's a P area, right? It's within the P circle, right? That's why, given that all the premises are true, the conclusion is true. That's why drawing the inference, you know, made you rational. Great. That's what the logician would say. Fantastic. So this was a little bit of propositional logic, right? Just for the record, right? Logic is much more complicated than that. Okay. Otherwise, you go home with the idea, yeah, they do mathematics, but you know, on the level of primary school, you know, 2nd grade. That's not what I want you to remember. Okay. So please remember at the same time, logic is much more complicated. Okay. Okay. Right. But that's why the inference is rational. Okay. Now you might have noticed at this point, great, he started with drawing an inference, you know, the physicist or the scientist in general would look at the state trajectories and how they change when you undergo this brain process and so on. Then doing things again philosophically, logically, but all of a sudden you wonder, where's the mind gone, right? You know, in all of this, I never, you know, referred to the mind or mental processes again, right? These Fregean thoughts were supposed to be like numbers, abstract objects, right? And their relationships that lead you from here to here, right? That's pure logic or mathematics again. That's purely abstract again. So it seems, you know, the mind has dropped out of the picture. And that's exactly what happened in the history of logic at this point, right? That's what's called the psychologism debate. And the idea was at the time that logicians like Frege and Husserl and others, they sort of argued on the basis of the new developments in logic, one should separate logic from psychology. These are two very different subjects, right? Each of them being important, in their own right, but keep them separate, right? And that was a good idea at the time, a very good idea at the time. And it was a necessary step for logic to become a discipline of its own kind. So that's perfectly fine. And that's what happened. Here you have Frege, right? Late 19th century. Then you have Whitehead and Russell's famous Principia Mathematica, which were as important for logic as Newton's Principia Mathematica were back then for physics, right? And then off you go, right? You have heard about the incompleteness theorems in logic, so that's Kurt Gödel. Another Austrian, if I may say, okay? And so on, okay? That's the development of logic. Now, actually, at the same time, pretty much, right, another new discipline emerges. And that's the setting for my whole play, right? The neurosciences. Neuroscience as a subject of its own kind, right? Emerging from different sources, obviously, right? From biology and medicine, basically, right? And at the beginning, there is no connection between these two developments, right? Neuroscience and logic. And of course, right, makes sense. I mean, both of them are sort of, occupied with emerging as an independent discipline, right? So why would they relate to each other, right? And of course, they were missing, systematic conceptual ingredients that would have even made it possible to relate the two developments at the time. But this is going to change now, okay? And that's the second act. The action is rising. I mean, you can feel it, right? Yeah, or maybe not. Okay. Anyway, and that's also the second act where our hero, logic, gets a face, and that's the face. Okay? And the face is Warren Sturgis McCulloch's face, an American, actually trained as a medical doctor, then specializing in psychiatry and neurology. He did take up a position in the 1950s at the MIT and stayed there until the end of his life. And he's the first one to make a connection between, my big topics, logic and the brain. He would say things like, the nervous system is par excellence a logical machine, and that will be the relationship. Okay. Now, you don't see that very well, but first of all, he's smoking. Okay. Not that this is so interesting, but anyway. And the other thing is he has the blackboard here, and you can see the little lines here and dots and so on, right? There are 4 places. There might be a dot or not. That's a truth table. Okay. So being a neuroscientist, you still see the truth tables here. That's exactly, what Wittgenstein had in the Tractatus. It's denoted a little bit differently, but it's the same thing. When McCulloch sort of, was pressured too much, after a talk in the questions and answers session, right? He's known to say things like, don't bite my finger, look where I'm pointing. Okay? And that, of course, within a discussion could mean, well, leave me alone with the details, see the broad picture, see where I'm going, and so on. But you can also take it more seriously and think of it in a way, if you want to understand why I'm pointing somewhere, right? It makes good sense to look where I'm pointing, right, in order to understand that. Accordingly, in order to understand what's going on in the brain, right, it might be a good idea to look what the brain is pointing to, right? And that is this relationship of intentionality again that I mentioned before. Now, he was the first one who saw that the revolution that was going on in logic, first of all, developing mathematical logic, right? Encoding symbolically the proof patterns that the mathematicians were using, and then applying them much more generally, right? This whole new field of logic, that this might be put to use when we want to understand the brain. He was the first to draw that relationship. But in order to come up with a theory for that, he very soon realized that you need a lot of mathematical and logical sophistication. Okay? So in order to relate these two fields, you need mathematics. Okay? And he wasn't trained as a mathematician. So very soon, he teamed up with the second phase for our hero, and that's Walter Pitts. So that's the other phase, right? That's the protagonist in two phases. Okay. So here's a little quote on Walter Pitts. That's from a book by Howard Rheingold, US-American author, who is interested in sort of the sociology of technology and science. He says the following: at the age of 15, Walter Pitts ran away from home when his father wanted him to quit school and get a job. He arrived in Chicago and met a man in a park, and as it happens, good luck, the man knew a little about logic. Okay. This man, Bert by name, okay, suggested that Pitts read a book by the logician Carnap, right? Famous logician and philosopher from the Vienna Circle, right? Austria. Okay. And he did that, right? Carnap at the time was teaching in Chicago. Bert, this guy that Walter Pitts met in this park, turned out to be Bertrand Russell, right? The famous philosopher and logician, right? The one who wrote Principia Mathematica together with Alfred North Whitehead. And Pitts introduced himself then to Carnap in order to point out a mistake the great logician had made in his book, right? And the rest is history. Of course, this is sort of a nice story. I don't believe a word, right? Come on, you go to a park and then you meet someone who's called Bert, and that's Bertrand Russell. And never happened to me. But there is, some true core to it. So it is true that Walter Pitts was something like a logic prodigy. He did run away from home, so he had a difficult childhood. When he was 15, he did have some exchange of letters with Bertrand Russell. That's what he did. Right? He did move to Chicago. He did read Carnap's Logical Syntax of Language and Carnap's logic textbook. Okay, so books that Carnap had written. Carnap was a professor at the time in Chicago. And it seems what is true is that he read one of Carnap's books, made lots of notes, right? But he was very shy, so he didn't want to talk to Carnap. So basically, he sneaked into Carnap's office and put these books with the annotations and so on the table and ran away. Okay? And later on, they properly met and all of that. Okay? So then Walter Pitts was part of this logic philosophy scene at the time in the US and so on. Okay? So that seems to be the truth. And in Chicago, that's also where Walter Pitts met Warren Sturgis McCulloch. And, a friendship developed, but also a scientific collaboration. And this led to this landmark paper, which for the first time established a close relationship between logic and the neurosciences. And what they did effectively was a little bit of logical abstraction. Okay? One other bit of logical abstraction you already saw in action. Remember, we started with this information, these premises that I gave you at the beginning, right? These were sentences in natural language. But then what we did was, ultimately, we abstracted away from these sentences and ended up with expressions like P or Q, right? Only being interested in the truth values of the two parts P, Q, and how to determine the truth value of the complex thing, P or Q, from the parts, right? That's already a bit of logical abstraction. That's what logicians do. They abstract from natural language sentences their logical form. And what McCulloch and Pitts did, effectively, was they took little parts of the brain, right, like neurons and how they relate to other neurons, and abstract from that their logical function. And that is what they did in a famous paper from 1943, right? Now, I won't tell you about that, right? Some of you might be neuroscientists, right? And even if you're not, you might know much more about that than I do, okay? But you know the standard story, right? Neurons, sort of summing up stimuli that come from other neurons, right? Something happens, some sort of threshold operation, right, is applied, right? If the sum is above the threshold, neuron fires, like that's like a 1 or a true or a W for var, right? If it's below the threshold, nothing happens. That's like a 0, right? Or a false or an F for falsch. Remember the truth table, okay? And then energy spreads, right? Reaches the synaptic clefts, usually bridged in some chemical way, and thereby the neuron takes some influence on other neurons and so on and so forth, okay? And from that biological structure, McCulloch and Pitts abstracted their logical form. And that's how their paper starts. It's called a logical calculus of the ideas immanent in nervous activity. Okay? And you can see the first sentence, right? Because of the all or none character of nervous activity. So this is this firing, not firing that I just mentioned. Neural events and the relations among them can be treated by means of propositional logic. And that's this bit of logic that I introduced to you before with the Euler-Venn diagrams and the truth tables. Okay? And that's what they did. For example, so these are little example neural networks that you find in the paper, right? They're numbered from A to I, and they are used in the discussion in the paper, right, as examples. Now, at the same time, all of these networks are then translated into logical formulas, as you can see. So that's our OR statement again, right? That's an AND statement. That's an AND not statement, using the notation of the Principia Mathematica and the notation of Carnap at the time. Okay, right? So really, 1C, right? So that's an AND. 1B, that's an OR, right? And these are the networks for that, right? So it's really that these neurons, right, are interpreted in terms of complex formulas, right? And the input neurons are interpreted like our propositional letters P, Q, R that we used before. Okay? So you can see the logical interpretation. And here's the idea. So this is a sort of simple McCulloch-Pitts type network, right? It's a very, very simple dynamical system. 3 neurons, right? 1 excitatory connection from N1 to N2, right? 1 inhibitory connection from N3 to this excitatory connection, meaning that if this is going to fire, this is going to cut the connection. Okay, that's how the network is set up, say. But if this is not cut, then energy is going to spread from here to here. That's the idea. Okay? And it's well known that neurons can have this excitatory or inhibitory impact, okay, depending on what the synapses are like and so on. So for example, say N1 fires at the beginning. What's going to happen in the next step, this is going to activate N2. Say this has a threshold of 1 in the sense that if there is 1 bit of energy coming, that's enough to excite the neuron, say, right? If no energy is arriving, it's not going to fire. Okay? But here something did arrive, so it's going to fire. And as long as this one fires, this is going to keep firing, and it will be a stable state. Nothing is going to change. But then again, if say at the beginning N1 and N3 are firing, right, then the energy from N1 won't reach N2 because this one will inhibit the excitatory connection, okay, the active line. And N2 will remain off, okay? So in logical terms, right, that's how McCulloch and Pitts would think about that. What does N2 encode? What's the logical function that N2 computes? It's going to fire if and only if N1 fires, but N3 does not fire, right? Or in logical terms, N2 here, this node, is really to be represented in terms of this logical formula, which means N1 and not N3. Okay? And you get the idea, hopefully, how this works. And if you have complex networks, then you can build up complex formulas and so on and so forth. And if you have a proper interpretation of N1 and N3, you get a proper interpretation of what the job of N2 is in that little network. And you all do it in terms of logic and truth functions. Here's another little example that's, again, directly from their paper. More complex network. You have N1 and N2 here, N3 and N4, and some nodes in between. Okay? And the idea is, let's say these are heat receptors. So that's for heat. That's for something cold on your skin, the surface, right? And then N3, if that's firing, it means heat sensation, right? You feel the heat, actually. Okay? And here you feel something cold if N4 is firing. So this is about sensation, and this is about what's actually going on at the receptor, right? And there is some in-between computation step, which is done here. And now the idea is very simple of this little network, right? So say N1 is firing, energy spreads, right? 2 ends here. Say this has a threshold of 2. So if the 2 of them fire, this is going to fire, and you will feel heat. Right? So if something hot touches your skin, next point of time you feel the heat. Fine. Say you have something cold on your skin and it's going to stay there for a little while. Okay? Then what's going to happen? Well, energy is going to spread to here and here. This connection alone wouldn't suffice to activate that, because say it has threshold 2 again. You need at least 2 sort of bits, right? 2 stimuli that come in here. But that's fine, you know, because this neuron at first excites that one. And then at the next point of time, right, this is going to spread. And still, since there will still something hot there, right, this is still going to fire. So, you know, after 2 points of the 2 periods of time, you will have the necessary 2 stimuli here in order for that to be activated. And you feel the cold. Okay. But now, say you first have something cold on the receptor, but then it's taken away. So what's going to happen in this little network, right? So at first this is going to fire, right? We'll move here, nothing happens, we'll move here, right? And then, you know, this one is turned off again, right? You take away what was cold before at the receptor, right? So there won't be any flow of energy along that line anymore, right? This energy flow alone won't be able to activate that one, right? So nothing's going to happen anymore. But this one was activated, right, from the previous point of time, right? So that will spread energy in that direction too. And since this will be turned off then, it won't inhibit that neuron. That's an inhibitory connection in the notation of McCulloch and Pitts, right? So if this first fires and then activates this, but then is turned off, right? This can spread here, won't be inhibited, which would have been the case if this were still on. And then it can spread here, 2 ends, threshold 2, so this is going to fire. Meaning, if you first have something cold at the receptor and then you take it away, it's going to feel hot. And that's what happens here in this network, right? And you might think maybe you can use that, you know, to interpret something that's actually going on your skin and your brain and so on and so forth. That's the idea. And you can interpret all of that in terms of logical formulas. And that's what they did in the paper, right? So the message of their paper was that dynamics of neural networks can be represented in terms of logical formulas. And that's a completely new insight. And logic thus becomes sort of a foundation of mathematical biophysics, right? And in fact, in principle, what they showed was, give me any Turing machine, right? Any computer that you like, right? Doesn't matter how complex. They can build a neural network that does exactly the job of that Turing machine, given that the neural network has a potentially infinitely big memory. Okay, that's what you need. But that's what a Turing machine would need too, as every theoretical computer scientist can tell you. In other words, these abstract neural networks, right, they are just as powerful as Turing machines and can be interpreted logically just as abstract Turing machines, abstract computers can be. And that's a completely new insight. Okay. So this did come out in the Journal of Mathematical Biophysics, right? The first thing to say about that is look at the references, right? That's all of the references, okay? And it's just 3, logic references, that's all, in the Journal of Mathematical Biophysics. Right? That's how important logic was for that paper. Secondly, this paper was quite obscure at the time, so it's likely that this would have been completely ignored if John von Neumann hadn't taken it up. John von Neumann being famous mathematician, one of the founders of computer science, right? So he sort of made this result popular over and above this obscure journal, right? I think these days this journal is called Journal of Mathematical Biology, and it's not obscure anymore at all. It's sort of a respectable journal. All right, logic and neuroscience, finally in contact. Okay, so that's what happened here, 1943. And then this opened up a completely new area, this area of neural networks, right? And that flourished for a while. And then something happened here. You can see we're now, about 1970, early 70s. Then sort of this tradition stopped. Now, why is that? It had different reasons, right? Sort of biographical reasons. For example, McCulloch and Pitts died, right? I think in 1969. Frank Rosenblatt died, early 70s, I think 1971. Frank Rosenblatt was one of the, proponents of the study of neural networks at the time. And then there was a famous book called Perceptrons. Perceptrons were a particular class of artificial neural networks that were studied heavily at the time. And the book about perceptrons was written by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. And what they did was more or less to kill artificial neural networks for a while. So basically, they took the perceptrons, which are really, really simple artificial neural networks, and they showed that actually there is a lot that these simple neural networks can't do. So for example, primarily people wanted to train neural networks in order to learn something, right? And people gave them logical functions for them to learn these logical functions, right? One of these functions was the XOR function, the exclusive OR logical function. Remember, we had the inclusive OR, but there was also the exclusive OR, right? Why not train a neural network so that it would learn this function? And they proved mathematically that these simple perceptrons were not able, in principle, to learn the XOR, the exclusive OR function. Right? But of course, this was because they were, super simple, right? For example, they didn't have in-between neurons. They just have an input layer and an output layer, but no in-between neurons. If they had in-between neurons, then it's perfectly doable. Okay? And they should have known better. Minsky was a student of McCullough's. Paper later wrote the preface of The Embodiments of Mind, which is a collection of papers by Warren Sturgis McCullough. So they knew the neural network stuff very well, right? But they still killed the area for a while. And the deeper reason is, I think, that at the same time, pretty much, a new area emerged as well, and this was artificial intelligence. Right? And artificial intelligence directly, more or less immediately, descended from logic. Okay, so this is this line here. Right? So logic led to this idea that cognition, what's going on in the mind, could be symbolic computation. Right? And it doesn't really matter how you do it technically, as long as you have this logical level. Right? So the neural networks had this logical level of description too, right? But then the AI guys would say, but now, once we have seen that, take away the neural network structure. We don't need it anymore. We can do it directly in terms of symbols from the start, right? So this is what they did. That's the book that, criticized neural networks, and there you have it, the tradition sort of stopped. Right? But that's, of course, not the end of the story, right? Because it was taken up again in the early 80s. Under a new umbrella term, connectionism. And this time, these people were, again, very much informed by the neurosciences, like McCullough and Pitts were back then. But in the meantime, there was symbolic artificial intelligence that was logical from the start. And so these people, for them it was very important to distinguish themselves from symbolic artificial intelligence, and hence from logic. Okay? So that's why when this, new approach to neural networks emerged, it was against logic from the start, right? So that's the wars that I mentioned. You can see them begin now, okay, in the play. So here's the basic thesis of connectionism. And this would still have been perfectly compatible with everything that McCullough and Pitts did. All the essential cognitive capacities, of humans and animals, can be explained in terms of properties of artificial neural networks, okay? So you can always set up an artificial neural network which sort of abstracts away from your cognitive system enough so that you can explain everything that's important in your cognitive system in terms of abstract properties of this artificial neural network that you got by abstracting from your system. Okay, but here's how they distinguish themselves from, back then logical neural network research in the style of McCullough and Pitts. That's Paul Smolensky talking in a paper that appeared in 1988 in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and which sort of summarized in a couple of theses, what's so special about connectionism. And they would say the following: formalizing knowledge in soft constraints rather than hard rules has important consequences. So they would say logic deals with hard rules, right? The hard if then that we had and so on, right? Given the premises are true, then necessarily that's hard, right? Necessarily the conclusion is true and so on. We won't do that, he says. We want to have soft constraints rather than hard rules, okay? Hard constraints have consequences singly. They are rules that can be applied separately and sequentially, right? So that's logic. But then soft constraints, that what the connectionists are interested in, have no implications singly. Anyone can be overridden by the others. Okay, so here's the idea. What is it in a neural network which is sort of like an if-then statement in logic? It's the lines, right? The connections that connect neurons to neurons, right? But here's what can happen now in a network, right? A neuron fires and excites another neuron through a connection. That's fine. But it's only happening, right, if other connections, sort of, right, do not inhibit that behavior. Remember the little example network that I have, right? So it's sort of that if there is an inference going on in a network, it must be a cooperative process, right? None of the single lines is sort of like a hard rule in logic where you just can apply it once you have the premises, right? You also have to look, what the other lines are doing and the other nodes. So it's just a soft constraint that is expressed by a line rather than a hard rule. That's the idea, right? Adding soft constraints can repeal conclusions that were formerly valid, right? It might be that first energy gets transported along the line, then you add new lines, and something inhibits something, so it doesn't work anymore, okay? Subsymbolic inference, that's inference in neural networks, is fundamentally non-monotonic, Smolensky would say. And therefore, logic does not allow for an adequate description of what's going on in a neural network, right? So, hence, logic in the neurosciences, no way, okay? So, which means our hero, right? Our hero is in trouble. Right? Logic is in trouble in neurosciences. Okay. Now, what does Smolensky mean when he says inference here in the networks is fundamentally non-monotonic? So here's the idea. They would say, well, look at classical logic. Classical logic is monotonic, right? And then they would say, but what we have is non-monotonic. Okay. What do they mean when they say classical logic is monotonic? It doesn't mean that classical logic is boring. Okay. It means, well, remember our old inference, right? These were the premises, right? Whenever they are true, the conclusion must be true, right? And this is going to remain so even if you add additional assumptions, right? Say you add a couple of premises, P4, P5, P6, right? You check again, okay, whenever the premises are true, is the conclusion true? Sure, right? We knew that already, it suffices that P1, P2, and P3 are true for C to be true. If you then additionally assume that something else is true, right, still you can conclude C, right? It only depended on P1, P2, P3 anyway. Inference is monotonic, right? The more premises you have, the only thing that can happen is that maybe the more conclusions you have. It's like a monotonic function in mathematics, right? Roughly, the more premises, the more conclusions. Okay, the more input, the more output. And then they would say inference in neural networks is not like that. Doesn't have that property. And they would say, well, actually, common sense inference is not like that either. Okay? Why? So this is about the non-monotonicity of common sense inference. And then the same should be true of neural networks. That's what the connectionists would say. Here are a couple of examples, right? Tweety. Okay, that's the paradigm case example in that area. Say I give you the information that Tweety is a bird. And that's about common sense inference, okay? So don't think like a logician or a mathematician. Just common sense inference. I give you this information. There is this bird. You don't know him in person. Doesn't matter. It's called Tweety, and he's a bird, right? Okay, you draw an inference. Well, plausibly, Tweety is something that can fly, right? Because normal birds can fly. Or statistically, if you like, most birds can fly, and so on. It's a reasonable inference in everyday situations. So from that premise, you draw that conclusion. Fine, and you're rational doing so. But then I give you additional information, say. I don't just tell you that Tweety is a bird, but also it's a penguin. It's a penguin bird. What you then do if you're rational, right, given your background knowledge, is you withdraw the original conclusion. You no longer want to conclude that Tweety can fly, right? Why? Because it's true that most birds fly, but not most penguin birds fly, okay? So you no longer draw that inference, right? Here you have non-monotonicity, right? You have more information, but less of an output. And they would claim, common sense is like that, but neural networks are like that too, and hence we have a problem in logic. Logic doesn't apply to neural networks, okay? And again, I could say Tweety is a bird and dead. Tweety is a bird and its feet are set in concrete. You see, always the same thing. You withdraw the original inference. Okay? Examples always have to be cruel in philosophy here, right? That's right. Okay. Right? I'm a dodo. Dodos are birds. Birds can fly. Thus, dodos can fly. And you see what's going to happen, right? Right? And you know that they have died out, right? Dodos. All right. And accordingly, in a neural network, say for a moment, N1 would encode there is a bird there, right? N2, it's something that can fly. N3, it's a penguin, right? The same network that we had before. You give the network the information, well, actually, it's currently perceived that there is a bird there, right? You draw the inference. It's something that can fly. But if I give you the additional information that it's also a penguin, this is going to be inhibited, and you don't draw the inference anymore. That's the same non-monotonicity effect going on. And then connectionists would conclude, therefore, these state transitions cannot be interpreted in terms of hard rules. Logic is about hard rules. End of story. Now, of course, our hero has a reply, right? It's a logician, right? The logician's reply would be, well, that's all fine, right? But who says that there couldn't be a logic of soft rules or soft constraints, right? So that's like back then in geometry, right? Once we thought there's only Euclidean geometry. But then it turned out there's also non-Euclidean geometry. And this was very important in science, as you know, right? Accordingly, we started maybe with the logic of hard rules, right? But who knows, maybe there is a logic also for soft constraints. And if we use the rules of these sorts of logics, then we might be able, again, to describe what's going on in a network, right? And our hero would be back in the game in the neurosciences. And that's exactly what can be done, okay? So there are logical systems around, for example, in logic programming, something that's very important in computer science, okay? Where you can see soft constraints of that sort. The arrow goes from here to here. That's how they notate things. But don't worry about that, okay? But what a rule like that in a logic program would say, if you have something that is a bird, and no information that you have tells you to assume that this is a penguin. There is no penguin information, right? Then you're rationally permitted to draw the inference that this is something that can fly. Okay? That's what they sometimes call the default, right? By default, you would say, if it's a bird, it can fly, right? Unless you get the additional penguin information, and then you wouldn't draw the inference anymore. Okay? So the not here doesn't express, explicit positive information which you have, but rather the absence of a particular bit of positive information. Birds can fly, this says, up to exceptions, right? Penguins being exceptions. And these new soft if-then connectives, right, have different logical properties. There's simply a different logic than classical logic for that, right? So here is something that's all valid in classical logic, right? So every mathematician would draw inferences according to these patterns without any problem whatsoever, right? You've seen that, right? If A then C, then if A and B then C, that's a version of monotonicity again, right? You can strengthen this if part, no problem. But then also transitivity, if A then B, if B then C, then if A then C, fine, in classical logic. If A then B, therefore, if not B, then not A, right? If A then B, therefore, if not B, it must be the case that not A, right? That's contraposition in classical logic and so on. These are all valid for the hard if then. But they are no longer valid for the soft if then, okay? And that's just the way it is. It's a different logic. Why not, right? We've dealt with that bit. Here's another one. That's about transitivity, right? Most citizens of Munich are Germans. Fine. Most Germans are not citizens of Munich. Therefore, by transitivity, most citizens of Munich are not citizens of Munich. That doesn't sound right, right? So the two premises are very plausible, but the conclusion is not, okay? Which means transitivity can't be a valid pattern of inference for these new, most normal if-thens, okay? Accordingly, most humans are not diabetics, right? Contraposition would tell you now, most people for whom it's not the case that there are no diabetics, that is, most people who are diabetics, right, double not, right, are not humans. That's not even politically correct, right? Let alone logically correct, okay? So, but new logic, new rules, that's fine, right? And in fact, that's what some people are doing these days, right? So they analyze these soft inferences, right? And that's done in theoretical computer science in this area called non-monotonic reasoning, which has been a hot topic, since the 1980s. And then precisely such defeasible logical rules, right? These weak if-thens, okay, are now used by some researchers to describe the dynamics of neural networks, right? So that's exactly what you would expect. For example, Steffen Höldobler does that in Dresden, and so on. So these are computer scientists who do that, okay?
So that's the comeback of our hero, right? Logic is back in the game. You just have to move from classical logic to a logic of, soft if-thens in that way. Fine. Ta-da, okay. Fourth act. Okay. Now, okay, does that mean all is well for logic in connectionism? Not quite. Okay. There is a second part, a second aspect to connectionism that we haven't even touched. And this aspect is called distributed representation. So that's again Smolensky in this paper on the basic thesis of connectionism. He would say the following. So we hold the subconceptual unit hypothesis. It says the entities in the intuitive processor with the semantics of conscious concepts of the task domain are complex patterns of activity over many units. Okay. So let me translate that. Okay. It says, if you look at a network, right, and you take some, information that you can express plausibly in terms of symbols, like natural language or so, right? What is it in a network that corresponds to these symbols that you can interpret in natural language? Well, it's not single nodes or single lines, but rather it's distributed representation. It's a whole pattern of activation over the network that encodes a symbol. It's the whole topology, the way lines are set up in a network, that encodes symbolic information, okay? That's the idea. So every node might participate in many such patterns that are the representations of symbols in the network, okay? It's not that you have one node, one information. It's rather you have lots of nodes, one information, right? You change this pattern of activation a little bit, you change something on a symbolic level. But the symbols are always represented in a distributed manner. They are distributed throughout the network. That's the idea. And then he would say, and that's against logic again, complete, formal, and precise descriptions of the intuitive processor, on the level of symbols, that is, are generally tractable not at the conceptual level, at the levels of symbols or patterns of activation, but only at the subconceptual level of the nodes. So this means, fine, we have the symbols now in the network, right? That's patterns of activation, distributed things. But now we want to draw, say, inferences. Okay? Inferences move from symbols to symbols, from patterns to patterns. And he would claim you can't describe that transition in terms of plausible symbolic rules anymore. The only place where you can describe something in terms of rules is the local level. You can say something, we said that before. If you have a node, it sums up energy, right? If you're above the threshold, then this is, and that is going to happen. That you can do. That you can express in language, and I just did. But that's at the local level where you don't find any symbols. Okay? At the level where you do find the symbols, at the levels of patterns, that are spread through the whole network, there you don't find any symbolic rules anymore. So you still have the symbols in a network, but sort of the if-thens, the rules, you can't express them anymore in terms of symbols. So still logic has a problem, because logic was all about inference, remember. That's what Smolensky would say. Hence, logic still does not allow for an adequate description of what's going on in a neural network, right? And that's a problem even for these people, because here the nodes, right? Remember, they're still interpreted as, symbols, right? You attach really the symbols to single nodes, and you read single lines as if-then rules. But then the proper connectionist would say that's not what we mean. You can't do that, okay? So that might be a nice logical description of what's going on in a network, but it's not one that we connectionists, the new generation of neural network users in cognitive science, can appreciate. So logic still has a problem. In other words, right, they would say there is no grandmother cell in the brain. Okay, so that would be a grandmother cell. It's not my grandmother, but okay. A grandmother cell being a cell that's firing if and only if you think of your grandmother, okay, one of them at least. Okay. But that's not a plausible way of representation. I mean, at least in a general case, right? It's a very inefficient representation. It's also, say this dies, no thoughts of grandmothers anymore, right? That's not nice, okay? And it's very implausible, okay? So one can't account for the information flow in the brain or in neural networks if one interprets single nodes or single lines by means of logical formulas. But that's so far what we have. Well, actually, there is another reply for our logician. So, okay, the battle's still continues. Okay? Our logician doesn't give up. All right, our logician would say. So let's take seriously the distributed representations of our Phrygian thoughts by neural assemblies. Okay? So let's take for granted even distributed representation. So which means now, remember these diagrams, right? Now we take them in a more literal sense. So these are now little neurons, right? And the information P or Q is really a whole pattern, of activation spread through the whole network, and that would be the whole network. Okay? So P or Q is now not assigned to a node, but to a whole pattern of activation, right? If more neurons are firing, still the P or Q information might be there, right? That's the idea. And accordingly for the other premise formulas that we had before, but now read them as sort of, activation patterns. That's perfectly fine. Okay? Let's furthermore, add an assumption, namely, let's say that composed thoughts, something like P and Q, right? Their activation patterns can be generated in some way from the activation patterns of the parts of P and of Q. Okay? Actually, there's a lot in the connectionist literature that would sort of, give you support for a statement like that. Okay? So the idea is, say you have the pattern for P, okay? And you have the pattern for Q. What would be the pattern for P and Q? Okay? I mean, there are different ways of doing that. But think of these patterns for the moment as something like, feature detectors. Okay? So P is something like, right in front of me there is something red. Okay? And Q is, right in front of me there is something large. Okay? And then P and Q would be, right in front of me there is something, red and large. Okay? So then both of the feature detectors, right, for red and large should fire, right? Something that has both of these features, right? So which means both of the patterns should be active, right? In other words, the pattern for P and Q should be the union of the two patterns, right? So if you think of it in terms of sets or classes, this might sound a bit surprising, right? It's the and that corresponds to the union. You might think, in set theory, it's more like the or corresponds to the union of sets. But here it's sort of all slightly different, but still systematic. It doesn't matter. Okay? And maybe something analogous can be said for not and or and for other logical operators. Okay? That's the idea. Give me that. Then here's an example of what might happen. So we have our network again. I've added one node, so it's more fun. But otherwise, that's the previous network. It's still fine, to look at nodes and give them information, but you now view of single nodes as very small patterns. Okay? In general, however, it won't be a node information relationship, but rather a pattern information relationship, right? So for example, the information that this is something that can fly is spread over N1 and N2. Only if this pattern is active in a network, you have in the network the information that there's something that can fly. Okay? Has wings is N1 and N3, that pattern. Is a penguin is N1 and N4, that pattern. Okay? Right? So N1 by itself, that is bird. Okay? But that's just the exception. In general, it's whole patterns that will be the counterparts of formulas. Okay? So say you give the network the total information B, it's a bird at the beginning. That's all. Okay? Then what's going to happen? Well, energy spreads, stable state is reached. End of computation, right? Now you check which patterns are in there. Well, you see, of course, the B pattern is still in there. Of course, that's trivial, right? But also the N1 and 2, that's the can fly pattern is in there. So it's something that can fly. The has wings pattern is in there. The penguin pattern, that would be N1 and N4, is not in there, right? They're not all of them firing, right? So this means the network draws the inference from bird to can fly, from bird to has wings, right? But it doesn't, draw the inference that it's a penguin, right? And so on and so forth. Okay? And if you do things properly also for or and not, you get lots and lots and lots of interesting inferences going on, even in this little network, right? Now, if you start with the total input, it's a bird and a penguin, right? So this would be that pattern, including the B pattern and the penguin pattern at the same time. Then, of course, this line gets inhibited, N2 doesn't fire in a stable state, but N3 does. And the network draws the inference, to the N1 and 3 pattern, has wings, and lots of things more. But it doesn't conclude anymore that this is something that can fly, for example, right? That would be N2 and N1. It's no longer there. Okay? So now you have distributed representations, you have inferences, right? This is still a soft if-then, right? And it all looks quite plausible, right? And now, that's the logician speaking, right? Okay, that's nice. Maybe such if-thens that you get in this distributed manner are always, you know, subject to very nice logical laws. It won't be the logical laws of classical logic, but maybe it's the logical laws of a different logic, right? And in fact, this is true. Okay, and that's a little theorem that I once proved. And I came to it through a paper by Balkenius and Gardenforth from the early 90s. So what they did is they set up sort of a neural network semantics for if-then statements, much along the lines that I sketched. Okay? And then they set up simulations of neural networks, and they checked sort of what kind of inferences would the neural networks draw. And they saw, you know, all of these inference patterns were always sort of valid in this semantics. So they found new rules of inference, as it were, right? But all by experiment. Okay, and what I did was then, I put this all into proper mathematical terms, and then actually proved that this was not, you know, accidental, what they found in their experiments, but this must be so. Okay? Meaning, whenever, for example, a network draws the inference from A to B and from A to C, it must always, if it's done in a distributed fashion that I sketched, right, it must always also draw the inference from A and B to C. And that's generally valid, whatever the pattern for A is, whatever the pattern for B is, and whatever the pattern for C is. Okay? Now, what is this kind of strange rule? It's not that strange. Okay? Have a look. Drop that information, right? Forget about it. Then you have premise, if A then C. Conclusion, if A and B then C. That would be, you know, this monotonicity rule, right? The strengthening of the left part, which we had for the hard classical if-then, but which we didn't want to have anymore for the soft if-then, right? And you don't have it anymore. It's not valid. But it does become valid again once you have additional information, namely, the B information that you add here is one that is already implicitly contained in A. That's this additional premise, right? If you have if A then C and B is already implicitly contained in A, then you may just as well make it explicit here in the if part. That makes sense, right? So this is a cautious form of monotonicity. It's monotonicity that you get under additional information. Okay? So all of the rules that you have here are sort of shadows, right, of the classical rules. But it's a new, very elegant and beautiful logic that you get for soft if-thens. And they are all realized by neural networks that draw inferences on the basis of distributed representation. And you can prove that. Okay? And the logician calls that a soundness theorem. Right? Whenever you give me a network and you read information into the network in this distributed fashion, then the network draws inferences according to these general rules. And then I proved also a completeness part to that. Whenever you give me a consistent set of inferences, a consistent set of such, you know, soft if-then statements, such that the set is closed under these nice logical rules, then I can cook up for you a neural network that draws inferences precisely in the way that you've given me. Okay? So there is a very precise back and forth relationship now between neural networks and their distributed inferences and logical rules in a logical system. And actually, the theorem applies to lots and lots of neural networks. So the networks that I've given you, they are super simple, right? But they don't have to be that simple. So for example, I didn't have any weights attached to lines, right? But the neural network people like that, right? But they need it for learning, okay? So you wouldn't just have a line which relates a node to another node, but you have a line and a weight like 0.8, right? Or 0.2 or 0.3. So lines can be thicker, as it were, right? Or less thick, right? You can have continuous activation states in nodes, for example. That's all fine. You can have feedback loops, right, in a network. That's all fine, and still the theorem is going to apply. You have more. So for example, say you make some assumption on what the network looks like. Say you assume I'm only dealing with neural networks without loops, without cycles. So the neural networks, say, that we might be interested in, are ones that have this layered structure. There might be lots of layers, right? But there are no feedback loops going on, okay? Many neural network applications are for networks of that kind. Then on the logical side, you get a new theorem, okay? Sort of you have more information on what the network looks like, So you get more information on what its logic is like. So for example, this new rule becomes valid then for all the networks that are hierarchical. What's this rule? At the beginning it might look strange, but it's not. So look here, it says the network, let's assume, draws the inference from A0 to A1, but also from A1 to A2, and so on, up to AN. Now transitivity, what you have in classical logic, would allow you to move from the beginning here to the end here, from A0 to AN. Right? That's transitivity. If A then B, if B then C, blah, 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 from the beginning to the end. I told you that's not valid anymore, right, with this soft if then. Okay, so you can't have that. But you can have the inference if you, again, add additional information. And the additional information in this case is if the network also draws an inference from the last item here to the first one here. Right? That's now closing the circle, as it were. If you can close the circle with your premises, then you can move from the first item to the last one here. Right? So again, it's like transitivity, but only given additional information. It's a cautious form of transitivity again. Shades of classical logic, right? And that you get if and only if the network is of this hierarchical structure. Thus, the message is, even given distributed representation, the dynamics of neural networks can be described in terms of soft if-then statements. And these statements actually obey a wonderful system of logic. Okay? And in this way, actually, you know, we might be at the beginning of something that might help us to understand what's going on in a neural network. Because that's a general problem, right? You have usually an input, you have an output, you train the network, you do stuff with it. But the network is like a black box. It's sometimes very hard to interpret what's going on, you know, while you learn something, while the network draws an inference and so on. But with methods like these, you might be able to understand actually state transitions in neural networks, right? It might be that it's very simple to see that these inferences in a network make good sense. And then by applying the rule, you might predict that actually the network also draws the inference from here to here. And why is that? Because these made good sense and the network obeys this logical rule. So then you sort of get a proof of what's going on in a network. And that might be a big help. And the logical systems that emerged are not dropping from heaven either. They are well known, right? So which enables you now to put together lots of areas that were not related before. So for example, precisely logical systems like this one, okay, have been studied intensively by theoretical computer scientists, again in this area called nonmonotonic reasoning. It's that part of nonmonotonic reasoning that allows for nice logics. That's a difference to nonmonotonic reasoning done by logic programming, you know, this first approach that I mentioned. There you don't get nice logical rules. But there is this other area in nonmonotonic reasoning where you do it like this, where you have nice logical rules. And the computer scientists know a lot about that since the 1990s, right? Philosophers and philosophical logicians have known about these logical systems for much longer. So note, philosophy being quicker than computer science. That's something that you could remember maybe after my talk. Okay? At least here, right? But actually in many cases. Okay? So the idea was, this is Ernest Adams, this is David Lewis, both passed away not that long ago, logicians and philosophers, right? And they were interested in the if-then connective in natural language, right? Either in the indicative mood or in the subjunctive mood, in the counterfactual mood, right? If A, then it is the case that B. If A were the case, then it would be the case that B. Things like that. The actual natural language if-then. And they wondered what's the sort of the logic for the if-then as we have them in natural language, right? Not sort of the artificial mathematicians if-then, but the real if-then that we have in natural language discourse. And they came up for independent, you know, reasons with logical systems. And it's precisely a logical system like that they came up with, right? So the same logic you find here for neural networks, you find it in theoretical computer science, and you find it in philosophical logic and philosophy of language, right? So it's sort of all of these areas coming together. All right, final act. Okay. So now a lot can happen, right? The hero can, you know, pass away, for example. Okay. Well, who knows? Okay, that's yet to be written. Okay. So what I wanted you to see was that rational inference in a neural network can be described from two perspectives which are not sort of opposed to each other, but which really ultimately complement each other. Okay? On the one hand, you can see the network as a dynamical system, and that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly valid. It's an important perspective. Okay? But then there is also this intentional, symbolic perspective, right? That's the philosophical tradition or the logician's tradition. And that's valid and fine too, even for neural networks. And actually, we can use mathematics to build a bridge between them. That's like the soundness and completeness theorem that I had before, right? And in this way, lots of areas, sort of, which might normally have been thought as being opposed to each other, now actually help each other. So that's good, okay? Now, our hero was really in the setting of neurosciences, and they are not about artificial neural networks, but really about brains, okay, biological structures. So, can we translate these results easily into neuroscience? No, okay? Because, after all, these results apply to very artificial creatures, right? Artificial neural networks. And in order to get them, we had to abstract away a lot of information about the real brains. And if that is crucial information, right, then our results on the artificial neural networks won't tell us enough, or might even be misleading, who knows, right? As far as our study of real brains go. That's yet to be seen, who knows, okay? But there's no, immediate inference now that would allow us to draw inferences on brains. But ultimately, of course, that's something that we would be interested in. So we'll see, who knows? There is a lot that I can't do so far on the logical side, and others can't do either. So for example, you might have noticed my networks. They were always sort of frozen in a sense, right? So for example, which node was connected to which other node? That was taken as a given. It didn't change. There was no dynamics of line dropping, line adding, or if you like, changing weights at lines. I didn't say anything about that, right? So it's sort of as if I had only dealt with trained networks, right? And then checked what kind of inferences they would draw given some input to some output, right? But learning in a network is crucial. Learning for our brains is crucial. Can we also describe the learning processes in a symbolic, logical way? That's a completely open question as far as I know, okay? But a really important, really interesting one. So it's hard to tell at this point, how far-reaching these results are. And yet, then there's also this sociological problem, right? Maybe, these are nice results, but maybe this is all much too late, right? In order to revive the place of logic, say, in something like the neurosciences, okay? Because, to be very honest with you, okay? So these results on logic programs, where a neural network is interpreted in terms of logic programs, right? This was one of the approaches. This is done by computer scientists. But the philosophers don't know about that. And the neuroscientists don't know about that, okay? So this is in one area. The results that I gave you at the end, right? Which are nice results in themselves, right? That's not known by the computer scientists, mostly, okay? And it's certainly not known by the neuroscientists, okay? So it's more like, philosophers and logicians doing something here, okay? So it's actually not true that all of these areas are sort of cooperating and there's a whole excitement. It's not true. There's no reason why this couldn't be the case, okay? But it's not happening so far. It might well not happen, okay? And then this will be a tragedy, okay? Our hero is going to die in this setting, right? In other areas, logic, is a big thing. But the question is really logic in the neurosciences. But we'll see. Who knows, right? Maybe this could all be sort of, really nice and funny and sort of cozy at the end, right? Maybe it is possible to use mathematics as some kind of lingua franca, right? In order to cross the boundaries between these areas again, right? Logic and philosophy, computer science, and the neurosciences. That's perfectly possible. So, the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy was mentioned at the beginning. So that's something that we established on the basis of this Alexander von Humboldt Professorship, right? And there's now a lot going on in this center currently, okay? And the whole center is about applying logical and mathematical methods to all kinds of philosophical problems and questions. It's about the application of mathematics in philosophy, okay? So for all the people in the center and many, many colleagues worldwide, okay, mathematics is really important in philosophy these days, right? Mathematics definitely is super important for computer science, right? There is no doubt about that, okay? And in the neurosciences, actually the same is true. So if you go to the website of the MCN, the Munich Center for the Neurosciences, Mind and Brain, which is at the Ludwig Maximilian University, my university, right? then, you know, they start with brain, neuro, and then, I don't know, second or third sentence mathematics, okay? Because we need, of course, a lot of experimental results on the brain. That's clear. It's an empirical discipline. But then again, we also need theory-guided experiments, right? And we need theories to interpret the experiments. And for those purposes, our neuroscientists would say we need mathematics. We need to use the language and the power of mathematics in the neurosciences. So maybe then mathematics might be the way to bring these areas together again. Okay, who knows? And if so, why not in Munich, right? I mean, nothing against other places like, you know, little cities like Berlin and so on. But we heard already that Munich is sort of, you know, the best. Okay, so we can just as well do it here, maybe, right? And if so, I'd like to think that would be a good end of the play. Thank you very much.